History is a story told in whispers and shouts. There are the shouts of great battles and world-changing discoveries. But then, there are the whispers. The quiet, unsettling stories that happen not on a battlefield, but on a city street. The stories of individuals who get tangled in the invisible webs of power and are simply erased. The story you are about to hear begins not with a gunshot or a scream, but with the closing of a taxi door on a hot summer night in the heart of Manhattan. On the evening of August 6, 1930, a New York Supreme Court justice, a man with a sterling public record and a future of immense promise, stepped into a cab on West 45th Street after dinner with friends and vanished from the face of the earth. This is not the story of a simple missing person. This is the story of a man who lived two lives, and the powerful, dangerous enemies he made in both. Before we delve into one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, we invite you to consider a question: what is more dangerous? The enemy you can see, or the system you are a part of? Leave your first impression in the comments below. Act 1: The Double Life of Judge Crater. To understand why a man vanishes, one must first understand the man. And to the public in 1930, Judge Joseph Force Crater was the very model of an American success story. But beneath this polished veneer of success lay another New York, and another Judge Crater entirely. The year was 1930, and America stood at a crossroads. The nation was in the early grip of what would become the Great Depression, with the stock market crash of October 1929 still sending shockwaves through every corner of American society. But in New York City, the Roaring Twenties had not yet given up the ghost entirely. This was still the era of Prohibition, a time when the law of the land forbade the sale of alcohol, and in doing so, had created a criminal underworld of unprecedented power and wealth. It was the age of the speakeasy, the hidden bar where the city's elite mingled with gangsters, where politicians cut backroom deals, and where the lines between the law and the lawless were hopelessly blurred. By 1930, estimates placed the number of illegal drinking establishments in New York City somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000. A staggering figure that meant there were more speakeasies in Manhattan alone than there had been legal saloons before Prohibition began. The Theater District, that glittering stretch of Broadway between 42nd and 54th Streets, pulsed with a particularly intoxicating mixture of legitimate entertainment and illicit pleasures. The marquees of grand theaters like the Lyceum, the Schubert, and the Belasco illuminated the night, while beneath street level and behind unmarked doors, a parallel world thrived. Here, in establishments like the famous 21 Club, the Cotton Club, and dozens of smaller, more discreet venues, the city's power brokers conducted their real business over bootleg champagne and Canadian whiskey. This was the world that had shaped and ultimately would destroy Joseph Force Crater. Born on January 5, 1889, in Easton, Pennsylvania, to Irish immigrant parents, Crater had displayed from an early age the combination of intelligence, ambition, and charm that would serve him well in the treacherous waters of New York politics and society. His father, Frank Ellsworth Crater, operated a produce market and owned orchards, providing the family with a comfortable middle-class existence that nonetheless instilled in young Joseph a hunger for something grander. At Lafayette College, Crater distinguished himself as both a scholar and a social networker, joining the prestigious Sigma Chi fraternity and cultivating the connections that would prove invaluable in his later career. But it was at Columbia Law School, where he enrolled in 1913, that Crater truly began to understand the intricate web of relationships that governed New York's legal and political establishments. Columbia in the 1910s was more than just a law school, it was a finishing school for the city's future power brokers. Here, Crater learned not just the intricacies of jurisprudence, but the subtle arts of influence and persuasion that would make him valuable to the right kind of people. It was also at Columbia that he met Stella Mance Wheeler, a sophisticated woman who was already married but clearly interested in exploring other options. The relationship with Stella revealed an early pattern in Crater's character, a willingness to pursue what he wanted regardless of conventional moral boundaries. When Stella divorced her husband, Crater moved quickly, marrying her just 7 days after her divorce was finalized in the spring of 1917. The haste suggested not just romantic passion, but a calculating understanding of opportunity and timing that would characterize his entire career. Upon graduation from law school in 1916, Crater opened a practice in the prestigious Equitable Building in Manhattan, a 38-story skyscraper that stood as one of the tallest buildings in the world at the time. But Crater understood that legal success in New York required more than just courtroom skills, it required political connections. He immediately joined the Cayuga Democratic Club, led by Martin J. Healy, one of Tammany Hall's most influential district leaders. Tammany Hall was not a building, but a political machine, the Democratic Party organization that had controlled New York City politics for nearly a century through a sophisticated system of patronage, kickbacks, and corruption. To get ahead in New York, especially in the legal and political world, you needed Tammany's blessing. The organization operated on a simple principle: loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty was punished, often severely. Crater threw himself into the work of the organization with characteristic energy. He spent time organizing election workers, representing the club in election law cases, and most importantly, making himself useful to the right people. His legal skills, combined with his understanding of how to navigate the complex relationships within Tammany Hall, made him a valuable asset to the organization's leadership. The machine rewarded competence and loyalty, but it demanded absolute discretion and unquestioning obedience in return. Those who served Tammany well could expect lucrative legal work, favorable judicial decisions, and eventually, appointment to positions of real power and influence. Those who betrayed the organization's trust, or who knew too much about its inner workings, often found themselves facing professional ruin, or worse. By the mid-1920s, Crater had established himself as one of Tammany Hall's most reliable and effective operatives. His law practice thrived, handling cases that involved substantial fees and high-profile clients. But more importantly, he had caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in New York's legal establishment, Martin T. Manton, a federal judge whose influence extended far beyond his official position. Martin Manton was a study in the corruption that permeated the American judicial system during the 1920s and 1930s. Appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in 1918, Manton had quickly established himself as one of the most influential judges in the country. The Second Circuit, based in New York City, decided a disproportionate share of the nation's most important commercial and financial cases, giving Manton enormous power over American business and finance. But Manton was not content with the prestige and salary of his judicial position. From his chambers in the federal courthouse, he operated what was essentially a business empire, with extensive real estate holdings, investments in numerous companies, and a network of financial relationships that created countless opportunities for corruption. When attorneys appeared before his court, they often found themselves approached by intermediaries who suggested that favorable decisions might be available in exchange for the right kind of financial consideration. Crater became one of Manton's most trusted associates, helping to manage some of the judge's more sensitive business arrangements and serving as a conduit for communications that Manton preferred not to handle directly. The relationship was mutually beneficial, Manton provided Crater with access to high-level political and business connections, while Crater's legal skills and Tammany Hall contacts made him an invaluable asset in Manton's various schemes. Through his association with Manton, Crater gained entree to a level of New York society that few men ever experienced. He became a regular at the city's most exclusive clubs, developed relationships with powerful businessmen and politicians, and began to accumulate the kind of wealth that his judicial salary alone could never have provided. By the late 1920s, Crater was living a lifestyle that would have been the envy of most successful attorneys, much less a state court judge. But success brought with it new temptations and new dangers. The same connections that had elevated Crater within the city's power structure also exposed him to its darker elements. The speakeasy culture that dominated New York nightlife was not just about illegal drinking, it was about the intersection of legitimate business, organized crime, and political corruption that made the city such a dangerous place for those who knew too much. This world of power and secrecy funded a second, hidden life for Judge Crater. While the public saw a devoted husband living quietly with his wife Stella in their fashionable Fifth Avenue apartment, the other Judge Crater was a man with an insatiable appetite for the high life. He was a regular on Broadway, known for his love of the theater and, more specifically, for his love of the beautiful young women who starred in the productions. The Broadway of 1930 was a glittering, seductive world that attracted ambitious young women from across the country. They came to New York with dreams of stardom, but many found themselves working as chorus girls, dancers, and hostesses in the clubs and theaters that lined the Great White Way. These women were often sophisticated, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful, but they were also vulnerable to the attentions of powerful men who could advance their careers or destroy them. Crater's primary companion in this world was Sally Lou Ritz, whose very name seemed crafted for the headline she would eventually generate. Born around 1908, Sally Lou was everything that epitomized the modern American woman of the jazz age. She was tall, slender, and possessed of the kind of sophisticated beauty that photographers and fashion illustrators used to define the era. More importantly, she was smart, witty, and utterly unimpressed by the conventional moral standards that governed the lives of most women of her generation. Sally Lou worked as a showgirl in various Broadway productions, but her real skill lay in navigating the complex social and financial relationships that surrounded the theater world. She understood that her beauty and charm were assets to be leveraged, and she was remarkably successful at parlaying these advantages into a comfortable lifestyle that included expensive clothes, jewelry, and access to the city's most exclusive establishments. Her relationship with Crater was an open secret in the theater district, a world where such arrangements were common and generally accepted. Powerful men often maintained relationships with multiple women, and the women involved understood that discretion and loyalty were essential to maintaining their positions. Sally Lou was particularly skilled at managing these relationships, maintaining her independence while also providing companionship and other services to men who could afford to pay well for her time and attention. But Crater's appetites extended beyond even Sally Lou's considerable charms. Investigators would later discover that he was involved with at least one other woman, a high-class call girl named Connie Marcus who catered to an exclusive clientele of politicians, businessmen, and other influential men. These relationships were expensive, requiring not just the money for gifts, entertainment, and other expenses, but also the kind of discretion that often came with its own costs. The lifestyle that Crater maintained in his secret life required enormous amounts of cash, far more than his judicial salary of $22,500 per year, equivalent to approximately $400,000 today, could possibly provide. The source of this additional income was the most dangerous secret in a life filled with dangerous secrets. Crater was deeply involved in the kind of financial arrangements that made Tammany Hall such a profitable organization for those who knew how to work the system. One of the most lucrative aspects of Crater's judicial position was his authority to appoint receivers in bankruptcy cases. When companies went bankrupt, the court would appoint a receiver to manage the company's assets and oversee their disposition. These appointments were enormously valuable, as the receivers were entitled to substantial fees and often had opportunities to profit from inside knowledge of which assets were most valuable. In one particularly notorious case, Crater had appointed himself as the receiver for a bankrupt hotel company. He then arranged for the company's assets to be sold to associates at a fraction of their true value. Shortly afterward, the city of New York purchased the same property for $3 million, creating enormous profits for the men who had bought it from the bankrupt company. While no direct evidence of corruption was ever proven, the circumstances strongly suggested that Crater had used his judicial position to enrich himself and his associates at the expense of the company's creditors and the taxpayers of New York. These activities, while profitable, were also extremely dangerous. The men involved in such schemes were playing for enormous stakes, and the penalties for betrayal or exposure were severe. Moreover, the arrangements required absolute trust among all participants, as any one person's cooperation with investigators could bring down the entire network. By the summer of 1930, the delicate balance that had allowed Crater to maintain his double life was beginning to collapse. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had appointed Crater to the Supreme Court in April 1930, was coming under increasing pressure to investigate corruption within the New York judicial system. Roosevelt, who harbored presidential ambitions, understood that his political future depended on maintaining at least the appearance of independence from Tammany Hall, even though he needed the organization's support to win New York State in any national election. The pressure for reform had been building for months, driven by a series of scandals that had exposed the extent of corruption within the city's courts and police department. In December 1929, Judge Albert H. Vitale had been robbed at a testimonial dinner, only to have the stolen goods returned after he made a few phone calls to underworld figures. The incident had raised uncomfortable questions about the relationships between judges and organized crime figures. Further investigations had revealed that Judge Bernard Voss had received $190,000 in return for obtaining pier leases for a shipping company, and that Judge George Ewald had paid Tammany Hall $10,000 for his judicial appointment. These revelations had created a political crisis that Roosevelt could not ignore, especially with his presidential campaign approaching. In response to the mounting pressure, Roosevelt had authorized the formation of what would become known as the Seabury Commission, headed by former Judge Samuel Seabury, to investigate corruption in the city's magistrate courts. Seabury was an ideal choice for the investigation. He was a respected former judge with impeccable credentials and, most importantly, he was known to be hostile to Tammany Hall and its methods. For men like Crater and Manton, the Seabury investigation represented an existential threat. The investigation had broad authority to subpoena witnesses, examine financial records, and expose the networks of corruption that had enriched so many powerful men. More dangerous still, the investigation was being conducted by men who were immune to the usual forms of pressure and intimidation that Tammany Hall used to protect its interests. The growing danger of exposure created enormous stress within the network of corrupt officials and their associates. Men who had grown wealthy through their participation in illegal schemes now faced the prospect of criminal prosecution, professional ruin, and imprisonment. The bonds of loyalty and mutual protection that had held the system together were beginning to fray under the pressure of the investigation. It was in this atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Crater received the phone call that would seal his fate. On August 3, 1930, while vacationing with his wife Stella at their summer cottage in Belgrade Lakes, Maine, Crater was summoned to the telephone for what would prove to be a fateful conversation. The call came in the early evening, interrupting what had been a peaceful day at the lake. Stella would later remember that her husband's demeanor changed completely during the conversation. He became tense, agitated, and unwilling to discuss the details of what he had been told. When he hung up the phone, he told her only that he had to return to New York immediately to straighten those fellows out and deal with a mess involving a company he was connected with. The vague nature of Crater's explanation, combined with his obvious distress, suggested that he had received news of a serious threat to his position or safety. Given the timing of the call, coming just as the Seabury investigation was intensifying its focus on judicial corruption, it seemed likely that Crater had been warned of imminent exposure or had been summoned to participate in efforts to limit the damage that the investigation might cause. Crater promised Stella that he would return to Maine in time for her birthday on August 9th, a promise that suggested he expected his business in New York to be resolved quickly. However, his behavior over the next few days would suggest that whatever he had learned during that phone call was far more serious than he had initially indicated to his wife. The journey from Belgrade Lakes to New York took most of August 4th, giving Crater time to contemplate whatever crisis awaited him in the city. By the time he reached his Fifth Avenue apartment that evening, he had apparently decided on a course of action that would prove to be his last significant decision as a free man. On the morning of August 5th, Crater made an unexpected trip to Atlantic City, New Jersey, accompanied by Sally Lou Ritz. The purpose of this trip was never fully explained, but it suggested that Crater was attempting to conduct some business away from the scrutiny that he might face in New York. Atlantic City in 1930 was a resort destination known for its casinos, boardwalk attractions, and relatively permissive attitude toward activities that might be illegal elsewhere. More significantly, Atlantic City was a neutral territory where men from different criminal organizations could meet safely to discuss business without fear of interference from rivals or law enforcement. If Crater was attempting to negotiate some arrangement with criminal figures, or to secure his position within a network of corrupt officials, Atlantic City would have been an ideal location for such discussions. The fact that he brought Sally Lou with him suggested that the trip served multiple purposes. She could provide companionship and cover for his activities, while also serving as a witness to any agreements that might be reached. Her presence also indicated that whatever business Crater was conducting was serious enough to require the involvement of someone he trusted completely. The Atlantic City trip lasted only one day, with Crater and Sally Lou returning to New York on August 1st. However, instead of returning immediately to Maine as he had originally planned, Crater decided to remain in New York for several more days. This decision would prove to be fatal. On August 3rd, Crater returned to Maine, but his visit was brief and tense. Stella noticed that her husband seemed preoccupied and anxious, quite different from his usual relaxed demeanor during their summer vacations. After spending less than 24 hours at the lake cottage, Crater announced that he had to return to New York again, this time promising to be back in time for Stella's birthday on August 9th. This second trip to New York began on August 4th and would be Crater's last. Whatever business he needed to conduct in the city was apparently urgent enough to justify repeated trips during what should have been a relaxing vacation period. The pattern of his movements suggested that he was responding to a crisis that was escalating rapidly and requiring his immediate attention. Upon his arrival in New York on August 4th, Crater went directly to his apartment at 40 Fifth Avenue and dismissed his maid, giving her an unexpected vacation. This decision suggested that he wanted to ensure privacy for whatever activities he was planning, and that he expected those activities to require the kind of secrecy that would be impossible with household staff present. The morning of August 6, 1930, marked the beginning of the final day of Judge Joseph Force Crater's documented existence. His actions on this day would be scrutinized, analyzed, and debated for decades, as investigators and amateur sleuths attempted to understand what had driven a successful judge to make the series of decisions that led to his disappearance. Crater arrived at his chambers in the New York County Supreme Court building early that morning, well before the usual start of business. For the next several hours, he engaged in activities that would later seem ominous in their implications. He spent considerable time going through his files, removing certain documents and destroying others. Witnesses would later testify that they saw him feeding papers into the fireplace in his chambers, burning what appeared to be important legal documents. The systematic destruction of records suggested that Crater was attempting to eliminate evidence of activities that he feared would be discovered by investigators. Given the timing, with the Seabury Commission's investigation intensifying, it seemed likely that he was destroying documents that could link him to corrupt practices or illegal financial arrangements. At the same time, Crater was also selecting other documents to take with him, loading several briefcases with papers that he apparently considered important enough to preserve. This selective process suggested that he was preparing either to flee or to engage in negotiations that would require him to provide evidence of other people's involvement in corrupt activities. Around mid-morning, Crater instructed his law clerk, Joseph Mara, to cash 2 checks totaling $5,150, equivalent to approximately $96,000 today. The clerk was told to convert the checks to cash rather than depositing them in Crater's account, a request that was unusual enough to stick in Mara's memory. The large amount of cash, combined with Crater's obvious preparations for some kind of significant undertaking, suggested that he was planning an operation that would require immediate access to substantial funds. After the clerk returned with the cash, Crater stuffed the bills into his pockets and took the loaded briefcases home to his Fifth Avenue apartment. He then gave Mara the rest of the day off, another decision that seemed designed to minimize the number of witnesses to his activities. That afternoon, Crater made a visit to his safe deposit box at the Chase National Bank. This visit would later prove to be highly significant, as investigators would discover that the box, which had previously contained valuable papers and possibly additional cash, was completely empty after his disappearance. Whatever Crater removed from the safe deposit box was never recovered, leading to speculation that he had been preparing either to flee the country or to pay large sums of money to someone for unspecified purposes. By early evening, Crater had completed his preparations for whatever he was planning to do. He had destroyed potentially incriminating documents, secured substantial amounts of cash, emptied his safe deposit box, and ensured that he would not be missed immediately. All that remained was to implement whatever plan he had developed during his anxious consultations of the previous few days. The final act of this elaborate preparation began when Crater made his way to the Belasco Theater, located at 111 West 44th Street in the heart of the theater district. He purchased a single-ticket Forged Dancing Partner, a light comedy that was playing to moderate audiences. The purchase of only one ticket was significant, as it suggested that he was not planning to attend the performance with Sally Lou or any other companion. However, instead of going directly to the theater, Crater made his way to Billy Haas's Chop House, located at 332 West 45th Street, just a few blocks from the Belasco. The Chop House was a well-known establishment in the theater district, popular with actors, producers, and the kind of sophisticated clientele that frequented Broadway shows and speakeasies. At the Chop House, Crater joined 2 companions who were already waiting for him, William Klein, an attorney who specialized in entertainment law and had connections throughout the theater world, and Sally Lou Ritz, who had apparently been expecting to see him despite his purchase of only one theater ticket. The meeting appeared to have been prearranged, suggesting that Crater had been planning this final dinner for some time. The conversation during dinner was never fully reported, but witnesses would later remember that all three participants seemed tense and that their discussion was conducted in low tones that suggested they were dealing with sensitive matters. Klein and Sally Lou would later provide conflicting accounts of what was discussed, but both agreed that Crater seemed preoccupied and anxious throughout the meal. The dinner ended around 9:10 p.m., with all three participants leaving the chop house together. They paused briefly on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, apparently concluding whatever business they had been discussing. Then, in a moment that would be endlessly analyzed and debated, the three companions separated. According to Klein and Sally Lou, they entered a taxi together, leaving Crater standing alone on West 45th Street. They claimed that he had said he was going to the theater to see Dancing Partner, and that he planned to walk the few blocks to the Belasco rather than sharing their taxi. However, their accounts of this final separation would later change, raising questions about what had really happened during those crucial final minutes. What is certain is that Crater hailed his own taxi shortly after Klein and Sally Lou departed. Several witnesses saw him get into the cab, which then drove off toward the theater district. That moment, the closing of a taxi door on a humid Manhattan evening, was the last confirmed sighting of Judge Joseph Force Crater. The taxi driver who picked up Crater was never identified, despite intensive efforts by police investigators. The cab apparently disappeared into the maze of New York City traffic, carrying with it one of the most powerful men in the city's legal establishment. Within hours, Judge Crater had become the most famous missing person in America, but it would be nearly a month before anyone realized he was gone. Act 2: The Investigation and the Wall of Silence. What was perhaps most shocking in the early days was not the disappearance itself, but how long it took for anyone to notice that a sitting New York Supreme Court justice was missing from his post. This delay would prove to be the first critical failure in what would become one of the largest missing person investigations in American history. Stella Crater, waiting at their summer cabin in Maine, was accustomed to her husband's unpredictable schedule and mysterious business trips. When he failed to return for her birthday on August 9th as promised, she was disappointed but not immediately alarmed. Joseph had missed previous commitments because of unexpected legal or political obligations, and Stella had learned to accept these disruptions as part of being married to an ambitious and successful man. For more than 2 weeks, Stella made periodic phone calls to their Fifth Avenue apartment, to Joseph's chambers at the courthouse, and to various clubs and associates in New York. Each inquiry was met with vague responses and suggestions that Judge Crater was probably attending to important business that required his full attention. No one seemed willing to admit that they had no idea where he was. The culture of discretion that surrounded powerful men like Crater worked against early detection of his disappearance. His associates were accustomed to asking few questions about his comings and goings, especially when those activities might involve sensitive political or personal matters. The same code of silence that protected him during his lifetime now concealed the fact that he had vanished. It was not until August 25th, when Crater failed to appear for the opening of the fall court session, that his colleagues began to express genuine concern. Even then, the initial reaction was to assume that he had been delayed by some emergency or had chosen to extend his vacation without notifying the court administration. It was almost inconceivable that a sitting Supreme Court justice could simply disappear. The first serious efforts to locate Crater were undertaken privately by his judicial colleagues and Tammany Hall associates, who had their own reasons for wanting to find him quickly and quietly. These men understood better than anyone the dangerous secrets that Crater carried, and they were acutely aware that his disappearance could lead to investigations that might expose the entire network of corruption that had enriched so many of them. When these private inquiries failed to locate the missing judge, the decision was finally made to contact the police. On September 3rd, nearly a month after Crater had last been seen, the New York Police Department was officially notified that Judge Joseph Force Crater was missing. The announcement immediately became front-page news in newspapers across the country, launching what would become the most publicized missing person case of the early 20th century. The NYPD response was massive and immediate, reflecting both the high profile of the missing man and the political pressure to find him quickly. Commissioner Edward Mulroney assigned thousands of officers to the case, making it one of the largest missing person investigations in the department's history. Detectives were dispatched to interview hundreds of witnesses, while patrol officers began searching every conceivable location where Crater might be found. The investigation was led by Inspector John A. Lyons, one of the department's most experienced and respected detectives. Lyons had handled numerous high-profile cases and understood the political complexities involved in investigating the disappearance of someone as well-connected as Judge Crater. From the beginning, he approached the case with the assumption that conventional investigative methods might not be sufficient to penetrate the web of secrets surrounding the missing judge. The first breakthrough came when investigators located William Klein and Sally Lou Ritz, the two companions who had been with Crater on his final evening. Klein, initially cooperative, provided a detailed account of the dinner at Billy Haas's Chop House and the circumstances of their final separation. However, his story contained inconsistencies that immediately attracted the attention of experienced detectives. Klein claimed that after dinner, he and Sally Lou had entered a taxi together, leaving Crater standing alone on West 45th Street. He insisted that Crater had said he was going to walk to the Belasco Theater to see Dancing Partner, and that this was the last time any of them had seen the missing judge. However, when pressed for details, Klein's account became vague and contradictory, suggesting that he was withholding important information. Sally Lou Ritz was even more evasive when questioned by investigators. She confirmed the basic details of the dinner but claimed to have no knowledge of what Crater had been planning after they separated. Her responses were carefully worded and seemed designed to provide minimal information while technically answering the questions posed to her. Experienced detectives recognized the behavior of someone who had been coached on how to handle police inquiries. This was the first indication that investigators were hitting what would prove to be an impenetrable wall of silence. The people in Judge Crater's two worlds, the respectable legal establishment and the shadowy Broadway underworld, were not talking. Witnesses who might normally cooperate with police investigations suddenly developed faulty memories or claimed to have no knowledge of the missing judge's activities. The taxi driver who had picked up Crater on West 45th Street became one of the most sought-after witnesses in New York City. The police launched an intensive campaign to identify and locate him, interviewing hundreds of cab drivers and checking the records of every taxi company in the city. Despite these efforts, the driver was never found. This failure suggested either that the driver was deliberately avoiding police attention or that more sinister forces were at work to ensure his silence. As the investigation expanded, detectives began to uncover the extent of Judge Crater's double life. The pristine public image that had made him seem like an ideal judicial appointment began to crumble under scrutiny, revealing a pattern of behavior that was both scandalous and potentially criminal. The discovery of Crater's relationship with Sally Lou Ritz was just the beginning. Further investigation revealed his involvement with Connie Marcus, the high-class call girl who catered to wealthy and powerful clients throughout the city. Marcus, when finally located and questioned, provided investigators with insights into a world that most respectable New Yorkers preferred to pretend did not exist. According to Marcus, Crater was a regular client who paid well for her services and was known for his expensive tastes and free spending. She described a man who seemed to have unlimited access to cash and who was comfortable moving in circles where criminal activity was openly discussed. However, like other witnesses connected to Crater's secret life, Marcus was careful to limit her revelations to matters that could not be independently verified. The financial investigation that followed these personal revelations proved to be even more damaging to Crater's reputation. Bank records revealed a pattern of large withdrawals and mysterious transactions that could not be explained by his judicial salary. In the months before his disappearance, Crater had liquidated investments worth $16,000 and withdrawn $7,000 from his bank account, amounts that together represented nearly half of his annual salary. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Crater's safe deposit box at the Chase National Bank was completely empty when they examined it after his disappearance. According to bank records, the box had been accessed on August 6th, the day of his disappearance, but bank officials could provide no information about what had been removed. The timing suggested that Crater had cleaned out the box as part of his preparations for whatever he had been planning on his final day. The pattern of financial activity suggested either that Crater had been preparing to flee or that he had been liquidating assets to pay large sums to someone for unknown purposes. Either possibility raised disturbing questions about what had driven a successful judge to take such drastic actions. As investigators dug deeper into Crater's financial affairs, they uncovered evidence of the corrupt practices that had enabled his expensive lifestyle. The bankruptcy receivership case involving the hotel company emerged as a particularly egregious example of how Crater had used his judicial position for personal enrichment. When the full details of the case became public, they provided a clear picture of how corruption operated within New York's judicial system. The hotel company case revealed a sophisticated scheme involving multiple participants, including real estate developers, political figures, and other judges. Crater had appointed himself as receiver for the bankrupt company, then arranged for its assets to be sold to associates at artificially low prices. Shortly afterward, the city of New York had purchased the same property for $3 million, creating enormous profits for the men who had bought it from the receivership. While direct evidence of bribery was never established, the circumstances strongly suggested that Crater had been compensated for his role in the scheme. The pattern was consistent with numerous other cases that were beginning to attract the attention of the Seabury Commission, which was investigating corruption throughout the New York court system. The political implications of these revelations were enormous. Governor Roosevelt, who had appointed Crater to the Supreme Court just months before his disappearance, faced serious questions about his judgment and his knowledge of corruption within the judicial system he was responsible for overseeing. The disappearance was becoming a major political liability for Roosevelt, whose presidential ambitions required him to maintain a reputation for integrity and competent administration. More dangerously for the men involved in corrupt activities, the investigation was revealing the methods and scope of the schemes that had enriched so many powerful figures. Each new revelation provided additional ammunition for the Seabury Commission, which was already causing serious problems for Tammany Hall and its associates. It was in this context that the investigation took its most ominous turn. The discovery of Crater's corrupt activities had established a clear motive for his disappearance, but it had not provided any definitive answers about what had actually happened to him. However, the investigation was beginning to uncover evidence of a larger conspiracy that extended far beyond simple judicial corruption. The key breakthrough came when investigators began to focus on Judge Martin T. Manton, Crater's mentor and associate in numerous questionable financial dealings. Manton, who served as senior judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, was one of the most powerful men in the American judicial system. His court handled many of the most important commercial and financial cases in the country, giving him enormous influence over American business and finance. However, investigators were beginning to discover that Manton had been systematically selling his judicial decisions to the highest bidder. Through a network of intermediaries, Manton had been soliciting payments from attorneys with cases before his court, offering favorable decisions in exchange for substantial financial consideration. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal income for Manton and had corrupted some of the most important legal decisions of the era. Crater's role in Manton's operation appeared to have been significant. As a state court judge with extensive political connections, Crater was ideally positioned to serve as a liaison between Manton and the network of corrupt officials, businessmen, and criminal figures who participated in the various schemes. His disappearance had potentially disrupted a complex web of relationships that had been generating enormous profits for many powerful men. The investigation into Manton's activities revealed the existence of a sophisticated criminal organization that operated at the highest levels of New York's legal and political establishments. The organization included judges, prosecutors, political leaders, and businessmen who worked together to manipulate legal proceedings for their mutual benefit. The corruption was so extensive that it threatened the integrity of the entire judicial system. For the men involved in these activities, Crater's disappearance represented both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, his silence ensured that he could not provide evidence against his former associates. On the other hand, the investigation into his disappearance was exposing many of the activities that he had helped to conceal. The most disturbing development in the investigation came when Sally Lou Ritz, who had been one of the last people to see Crater alive, suddenly disappeared herself. Just weeks after being questioned by police about Crater's final evening, Sally Lou vanished without trace. Her disappearance was never officially reported to police, and it was not until investigators tried to re-interview her that they discovered she was gone. Sally Lou's disappearance transformed the investigation from a missing person case into something far more sinister. The possibility that both she and Crater had been murdered to prevent them from providing evidence against powerful criminal figures became the focus of intensive police efforts. However, like the investigation into Crater's disappearance, the search for Sally Lou quickly ran into a wall of silence and obstruction. The pattern of disappearances suggested that a systematic effort was underway to eliminate potential witnesses and evidence. The fact that both disappearances had occurred just as the Seabury Commission was intensifying its investigation into judicial corruption seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a criminal organization that had the resources and connections necessary to make people disappear permanently. The investigation expanded to include known criminal figures who had been connected to corrupt judicial proceedings. Names like Annie Madden, the powerful bootlegger who controlled much of Manhattan's illegal alcohol trade, and Meyer Lansky, the financial genius behind many criminal enterprises, began to appear in police reports. These men had the motive, means, and opportunity to eliminate troublesome judges who knew too much about their operations. However, penetrating the world of organized crime proved to be even more difficult than investigating judicial corruption. The criminal organizations that controlled illegal activities in New York operated according to strict codes of silence, and they had developed sophisticated methods for eliminating threats to their operations. Moreover, many of these organizations had extensive connections within law enforcement, making it difficult for honest investigators to pursue their inquiries without interference. The wall of silence that surrounded both disappearances became increasingly impenetrable as the investigation progressed. Potential witnesses either claimed to have no knowledge of the missing individuals or provided obviously fabricated accounts that led nowhere. Physical evidence was mysteriously destroyed or lost, and official records disappeared from government offices. The investigation was also hampered by political interference from individuals who had their own reasons for wanting the case to remain unsolved. Governor Roosevelt, facing a presidential campaign, had no desire to see the investigation uncover additional evidence of corruption within his administration. Tammany Hall leaders used their influence to limit the resources available to investigators and to ensure that certain lines of inquiry were not pursued. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation revealed the extent to which corruption had penetrated the New York Police Department itself. Many of the officers assigned to the case were discovered to have financial relationships with the same criminal organizations that were suspected of involvement in the disappearances. This corruption made it virtually impossible to conduct an effective investigation, as information was regularly leaked to the subjects of the inquiry. By the end of 1930, it had become clear that conventional investigative methods would not be sufficient to solve the mystery of Judge Crater's disappearance. The case had exposed a level of corruption and criminality that threatened the foundations of New York's legal and political systems, but it had not provided definitive answers about what had happened to the missing judge. The failure to solve the case had profound implications for everyone involved. For the investigators, it represented a humiliating defeat that called into question their competence and integrity. For the political leaders who had hoped to contain the scandal, it created an ongoing source of embarrassment and suspicion. And for the criminal figures who may have been responsible for the disappearances, it provided a demonstration of their power and the futility of challenging their operations. The investigation officially continued for several more years, but it gradually became clear that no breakthrough was forthcoming. The wall of silence that protected the truth about Judge Crater's fate proved to be impenetrable, maintained by a combination of fear, corruption, and criminal efficiency that exceeded the capacity of law enforcement to overcome. The case became a symbol of the limitations of official justice when confronted with organized criminality and systemic corruption. It demonstrated that powerful criminal organizations could operate with virtual impunity when they had sufficient resources and connections to corrupt the institutions that were supposed to bring them to justice. For the surviving participants in the events of August 6, 1930, the investigation created a permanent state of uncertainty and fear. They understood that their own survival depended on maintaining the silence that had protected them thus far, but they also knew that changing political circumstances could eventually expose them to prosecution or worse. The mystery of Judge Crater's disappearance became embedded in the folklore of New York City, a cautionary tale about the dangers of knowing too much in a world where powerful interests were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The phrase "to pull a crater" entered the American vocabulary as a synonym for disappearing without a trace, ensuring that the memory of the missing judge would persist long after the details of his life and death had faded from public memory. Act 3: The Theories and the Cold Case. Years turned into decades, and the case of Judge Joseph Force Crater evolved from an active criminal investigation into something far more enduring, a modern American legend. The failure to find his body or any credible evidence of his ultimate fate left a vacuum that was filled with theories, each one offering a different window into the corrupt world he had inhabited. The climax of this story is not a single revelation, but an exploration of the dark possibilities that his disappearance represents. The official investigation continued sporadically throughout the 1930s, but it became increasingly clear that conventional detective work would not solve the mystery. The wall of silence that had protected the truth about Crater's fate remained impenetrable, maintained by a combination of fear, criminal efficiency, and ongoing corruption that exceeded the capacity of law enforcement to overcome. As the years passed, the case file grew thicker with false leads, alleged sightings, and crackpot theories, but no genuine breakthrough ever emerged. In 1937, the New York Police Department made one final, concentrated effort to solve the case. A special squad of detectives was assigned to conduct a complete review of all evidence and to pursue any remaining investigative possibilities. The squad, led by Inspector John A. Lyons, who had headed the original investigation, spent months re-interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and following up on tips that had accumulated over the years. The renewed investigation uncovered several significant pieces of information that had been overlooked or suppressed during the original inquiry. Most importantly, investigators discovered that Crater had made several mysterious phone calls during his final days, including at least one conversation with a known associate of Meyer Lansky, the financial mastermind behind numerous criminal enterprises. However, despite these discoveries, the investigation failed to produce any definitive answers about what had happened to the missing judge. The failure of the renewed investigation marked the effective end of official efforts to solve the case. While the case technically remained open, it was no longer considered an active investigation, and no significant resources were devoted to pursuing new leads. Judge Crater had joined the ranks of America's permanently missing, his fate destined to remain a mystery. However, the absence of official answers did not end public fascination with the case. Instead, it created space for the development of theories and speculation that would keep the story alive for generations. Three primary theories emerged to explain Crater's disappearance, each supported by different evidence and reflecting different aspects of the corrupt world in which he had operated. Theory 1: Silenced by the system. The most widely accepted theory among historians and legal experts is that Judge Crater was murdered by his own political associates to prevent him from exposing the network of corruption that had enriched so many powerful men. This theory, sometimes called the Tammany Hall theory, rests on the premise that Crater had become too dangerous to be allowed to live. By the summer of 1930, the Seabury Commission's investigation into judicial corruption was closing in on the extensive network of bribery, kickbacks, and illegal financial arrangements that had operated within New York's court system for decades. Judge Martin Manton, Crater's mentor and associate, was already under suspicion for selling judicial decisions, and investigators were beginning to uncover evidence of the schemes that had generated enormous profits for corrupt officials and their criminal partners. Crater, as one of Manton's key associates and a participant in numerous corrupt transactions, possessed detailed knowledge of how the system operated. He knew which judges had been bought, which cases had been fixed, and which political figures had profited from the various schemes. Most dangerously, he had documentary evidence of many of these transactions, including financial records and correspondence that could have provided prosecutors with the evidence needed to secure convictions against dozens of powerful men. The phone call that summoned Crater back to New York from his Maine vacation was likely a trap, designed to lure him to a meeting where he could be eliminated before he had a chance to cooperate with investigators. The mysterious caller may have claimed that arrangements were being made to protect him from prosecution, or that his cooperation was needed to limit the damage that the investigation might cause to their mutual associates. According to this theory, Crater was probably murdered on the evening of August 6th, shortly after leaving Billy Haas's Chop House. The dinner with William Klein and Sally Lou Ritz may have been arranged to establish his presence in the theater district at a specific time, making it easier for his killers to locate him. Klein and Ritz, whether willingly or under duress, provided alibis for themselves while ensuring that Crater would be alone and vulnerable when he left the restaurant. The murder itself was probably carried out by professional killers with extensive experience in making people disappear permanently. The criminal organizations that controlled illegal activities in New York had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of bodies, often using techniques that ensured no physical evidence would ever be recovered. Crater's body may have been dissolved in acid, encased in concrete and dropped into the ocean, or incinerated in one of the many industrial furnaces that operated throughout the city. The efficiency of the disposal operation suggests that it was planned and executed by individuals with access to substantial resources and specialized knowledge. The fact that no trace of Crater was ever found, despite intensive searches by both police and private investigators, indicates a level of criminal expertise that was probably available only to major organized crime figures. The systematic elimination of other potential witnesses, including Sally Lou Ritz, supports the theory that a coordinated effort was underway to protect the corruption network from exposure. The disappearances were timed to occur just as the Seabury Commission was intensifying its investigation, suggesting that the decisions to eliminate these individuals were made by people who had detailed knowledge of what the investigation was uncovering and who understood the threat that key witnesses represented. The silence by the system theory is supported by the subsequent history of corruption prosecutions in New York. Judge Martin Manton was eventually convicted of conspiracy to obstruct justice in 1939, nearly a decade after Crater's disappearance. The delay in bringing charges against Manton suggests that prosecutors had difficulty gathering the evidence needed to secure convictions against corrupt officials, evidence that might have been readily available if Crater had lived to testify. Moreover, the pattern of corruption that was eventually exposed closely matched the activities that Crater was suspected of participating in during his career. The bankruptcy receivership schemes, the sale of judicial appointments, and the systematic bribery of court officials were all elements of a comprehensive criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while undermining the integrity of the legal system. The political implications of Crater's murder also support this theory. His elimination served the interests not just of criminal organizations, but also of political figures who had benefited from the corrupt system. Governor Roosevelt, facing a presidential campaign, had every reason to prefer that certain aspects of New York's judicial corruption remain hidden. The disappearance of a key witness eliminated a potential source of embarrassment while allowing Roosevelt to maintain his reputation as a reformer. Theory 2: Murdered by the mob. The second major theory attributes Crater's disappearance to his involvement with organized crime figures who controlled much of New York's illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition. According to this theory, Crater had become financially indebted to powerful criminal organizations or had participated in schemes that went wrong, leading to his elimination when he became more of a liability than an asset. Crater's expensive lifestyle and his relationships with Broadway showgirls had put him in regular contact with the criminal figures who operated the city's speakeasies and illegal gambling establishments. These men, including powerful bosses like Annie Madden, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, had extensive business relationships with corrupt officials and were known to eliminate individuals who threatened their operations. The connection between Crater and the criminal underworld was more than casual social contact. Investigators discovered evidence that he had been involved in money laundering schemes that allowed criminal organizations to convert illegal proceeds into seemingly legitimate investments. His judicial position made him particularly valuable for these purposes, as he could ensure that legal challenges to suspicious financial transactions were resolved in favor of the criminal participants. One specific area of involvement appears to have been the manipulation of bankruptcy proceedings to benefit criminal investors. Crater's authority as a receiver in bankruptcy cases gave him the power to determine which creditors would be paid and which assets would be sold at below-market prices. By coordinating his decisions with criminal associates, he could ensure that valuable assets were transferred to criminal organizations at prices that guaranteed substantial profits. However, these relationships were inherently dangerous, as they created opportunities for disagreements and double crosses that could have fatal consequences. Criminal organizations operated according to strict codes that demanded absolute loyalty and severely punished betrayal. If Crater had attempted to cheat his criminal partners or had threatened to expose their operations to law enforcement, his elimination would have been swift and final. The timing of Crater's disappearance supports this theory, as it occurred during a period of intense pressure from law enforcement that was making many criminal figures nervous about their security. The Seabury Commission's investigation was not limited to judicial corruption, but also included inquiries into the relationships between corrupt officials and organized crime. Criminal leaders may have decided that Crater represented an unacceptable security risk that needed to be eliminated before he could provide evidence against them. The professional efficiency of Crater's disappearance also suggests the involvement of criminal organizations with extensive experience in eliminating threats. The fact that his body was never found, despite intensive searches, indicates the use of disposal methods that were available only to individuals with access to specialized facilities and techniques. Criminal organizations in New York had developed sophisticated methods for making people disappear, often using industrial equipment and locations that ensured no physical evidence would ever be recovered. The disappearance of Sally Lou Ritz provides additional support for the criminal organization theory. As Crater's companion in the Broadway underworld, she would have had knowledge of his relationships with criminal figures and his participation in illegal activities. Her elimination shortly after his disappearance suggests that a systematic effort was underway to remove all witnesses who could provide evidence about criminal activities. Moreover, the pattern of intimidation and obstruction that characterized the investigation into Crater's disappearance was consistent with the methods used by criminal organizations to protect themselves from law enforcement. The wall of silence that prevented witnesses from providing information to police, the mysterious disappearance of physical evidence, and the apparent corruption of some investigators all reflected the influence that criminal organizations exercised over law enforcement agencies. The criminal organization theory is also supported by the subsequent history of similar cases involving corrupt officials who had relationships with organized crime. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, numerous individuals who had knowledge of criminal activities disappeared under suspicious circumstances, often just as law enforcement investigations were beginning to focus on their activities. Theory 3. The Great Escape. The third and most romantic theory suggests that Crater, realizing that his corrupt activities were about to be exposed, staged his own disappearance and fled to begin a new life elsewhere. According to this theory, the systematic preparation that characterized his final days was not preparation for murder, but preparation for a carefully planned escape that would allow him to avoid prosecution and social disgrace. Proponents of this theory point to the large amounts of cash that Crater had assembled in his final weeks, arguing that these funds were intended to finance a new identity and lifestyle in a location where he would not be recognized. The $5,150 that he had withdrawn on his final day, combined with whatever he had removed from his safe deposit box, would have provided sufficient resources for an extended period of living under an assumed identity. The destruction of documents in his chambers could have been designed to eliminate evidence that might help investigators track him to his new location, while the selection of other documents to take with him might have been intended to provide leverage against former associates who might attempt to expose his whereabouts. His knowledge of corrupt activities could have served as insurance against retaliation, ensuring that his former partners had incentives to help maintain his disappearance rather than expose it. The timing of his disappearance, just as the Seabury Commission was beginning to focus on judicial corruption, supports the theory that he was attempting to avoid prosecution. A man of Crater's intelligence and political connections would have understood that the investigation posed an existential threat to his career and freedom. Rather than face certain disgrace and possible imprisonment, he may have chosen to disappear while he still had the resources and freedom to do so effectively. The involvement of Sally Lou Ritz in his final evening could have been part of the escape plan. As his companion in the Broadway underworld, she would have had connections that could facilitate the creation of new identities and the establishment of safe havens outside New York. Her own subsequent disappearance could have been the result of her joining him in his new life, rather than being eliminated as a potential witness. Several alleged sightings of Crater in various locations throughout the United States and abroad provide some support for this theory. Over the years, individuals claiming to have seen him were reported from locations as diverse as California, Florida, Mexico, and Europe. While none of these sightings was ever confirmed, the consistency of some of the reports suggests the possibility that he did survive his disappearance. However, the escape theory faces several significant challenges that make it the least likely explanation for Crater's fate. Most importantly, a man as recognizable as Judge Crater would have found it extremely difficult to maintain a new identity for any extended period. His photograph had been published in newspapers throughout the country, and his disappearance had generated so much publicity that he would have been recognized by many people in any location where he attempted to establish a new life. Moreover, the escape theory fails to explain adequately why Sally Lou Ritz would have disappeared separately, weeks after Crater's final evening. If they had planned to begin new lives together, it would have made more sense for them to disappear simultaneously, rather than creating additional opportunities for detection by law enforcement. The escape theory is also undermined by Crater's personality and background. A man who had spent his entire adult life pursuing status, power, and recognition would have found it psychologically difficult to accept the anonymity and reduced circumstances that would have been necessary to maintain a false identity. His expensive tastes and social ambitions were inconsistent with the kind of quiet, inconspicuous lifestyle that would have been required for successful escape. Perhaps most significantly, the escape theory does not account for the systematic elimination of other potential witnesses and the extensive efforts to obstruct the investigation into his disappearance. If Crater had simply fled, there would have been no need for the kind of criminal organization that appears to have been involved in covering up his fate. The official conclusion and ongoing mystery. Despite decades of investigation, speculation, and amateur detective work, no definitive evidence ever emerged to support any of the three major theories about Judge Crater's disappearance. The case remained officially open until 1979, when the New York Police Department finally closed the file after 49 years of unsuccessful investigation. At that time, Crater was officially classified as a victim of homicide, though no perpetrators were ever identified or prosecuted. The decision to classify the case as a homicide was based primarily on the systematic obstruction of the investigation and the pattern of witness intimidation that had characterized the case from its beginning. While no body was ever recovered and no direct evidence of murder was ever discovered, investigators concluded that the circumstances of Crater's disappearance were inconsistent with voluntary departure or accidental death. The formal closure of the case marked the end of an era in American criminal justice. Judge Crater had become a symbol of the limitations of law enforcement when confronted with sophisticated criminal organizations and systemic corruption. His disappearance demonstrated that powerful individuals could commit crimes with virtual impunity when they had sufficient resources and connections to corrupt the institutions that were supposed to bring them to justice. However, the official closure of the case did not end public fascination with the mystery. In the decades that followed, numerous books, articles, and documentaries examined the evidence and proposed new theories about what had happened to the missing judge. Amateur investigators continued to pursue leads and interview surviving witnesses, hoping to uncover the breakthrough that had eluded professional investigators for so many years. In 2005, the case attracted renewed attention when the New York Police Department revealed that a woman who had died earlier that year had left a handwritten note claiming that her husband and several other men, including a police officer, had murdered Crater and buried his body beneath a section of the Coney Island boardwalk. According to the note, the murder had been carried out on behalf of unidentified criminal figures who were concerned about what Crater might reveal to investigators. The alleged burial site had been excavated during the construction of the New York Aquarium in the 1950s, before advanced forensic techniques existed to detect and identify human remains. By the time the note was discovered, any physical evidence that might have existed had been destroyed by construction activities, making it impossible to verify or disprove the claims. The Coney Island revelation generated significant media attention and renewed speculation about the case, but it ultimately provided no more definitive answers than previous investigations had produced. The note was consistent with the silence by the system theory, but it contained no information that could be independently verified and may have been the product of someone's imagination rather than actual knowledge of criminal activities. Cultural legacy and historical significance. The disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater had a cultural impact that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the case. For decades, the phrase "to pull a crater" remained part of American slang, used to describe any mysterious disappearance or sudden absence. Comedians incorporated references to the missing judge into their routines, with the line "Judge Crater, call your office" becoming a standard joke in nightclubs and radio programs. The case also influenced the popular perception of corruption in American government and law enforcement. Crater's disappearance provided concrete evidence that the justice system could be compromised by criminal influences and that powerful individuals could literally disappear when they became inconvenient to the wrong people. This perception contributed to public cynicism about government institutions that persisted for generations. For historians and legal scholars, the Crater case represents a watershed moment in the evolution of organized crime in America. The sophisticated methods used to eliminate him and obstruct the investigation demonstrated that criminal organizations had developed capabilities that rivaled those of law enforcement agencies. The case marked the emergence of organized crime as a major force in American society, with the resources and connections necessary to corrupt governmental institutions at the highest levels. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities of the American judicial system to corruption and political influence. Crater's rise through the Tammany Hall system demonstrated how political machines could place loyal operatives in positions of enormous power and influence, where they could manipulate the legal system for their own benefit. The reforms that followed his disappearance were designed to address some of these vulnerabilities, but they came too late to prevent the damage that had already been done. The investigation into Crater's disappearance revealed the extent to which corruption had penetrated law enforcement agencies themselves. The wall of silence that protected his killers was maintained not just by criminal organizations, but also by corrupt police officers, prosecutors, and political figures who had their own reasons for wanting the truth to remain hidden. This revelation led to significant reforms in law enforcement procedures and oversight, though the process of cleaning up corrupted institutions proved to be long and difficult. Perhaps most significantly, the Crater case demonstrated the importance of press freedom and public accountability in combating institutional corruption. The extensive media coverage of the investigation, despite official efforts to limit it, helped to expose the scope of corruption within New York's political and judicial systems. This exposure created the public pressure that eventually forced reluctant officials to pursue reforms that they might otherwise have avoided. The case also contributed to changes in legal and judicial procedures that made it more difficult for corrupt officials to operate with impunity. New requirements for financial disclosure, judicial oversight, and ethical review were implemented in response to the revelations that emerged during the investigation. While these reforms did not eliminate corruption entirely, they made it more difficult for individuals like Crater to accumulate power and wealth through illegal activities. Final reflections on an unsolved mystery. The story of Judge Joseph Force Crater remains one of America's most compelling unsolved mysteries, a case that illuminates the dark intersection of politics, crime, and corruption that characterized an entire era of American history. His disappearance serves as a reminder that justice is not always achieved through official channels, and that powerful individuals can sometimes escape accountability for their actions through violence and intimidation. The failure to solve Crater's case also demonstrates the limitations of traditional investigative methods when confronted with sophisticated criminal organizations and systematic corruption. The wall of silence that protected his killers was more effective than any legal defense, ensuring that they never faced prosecution for their crimes. This reality highlighted the need for new approaches to combating organized crime and corruption, approaches that would eventually be developed and implemented in later decades. For the families and friends of Judge Crater and Sally Lou Ritz, the case represents a permanent wound that never fully healed. The absence of definitive answers about their fates meant that their loved ones could never achieve closure or properly mourn their losses. The uncertainty and speculation that surrounded their disappearances created additional suffering for people who were already victims of criminal violence. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of becoming involved with criminal organizations and corrupt networks. Crater's pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure led him into relationships and activities that ultimately cost him his life. His story demonstrates that the rewards of corruption are often temporary, while the risks are permanent and potentially fatal. In the end, the mystery of Judge Crater's disappearance may never be definitively solved. The people who knew the truth are almost certainly dead, the physical evidence has long since been destroyed, and the criminal organizations responsible have evolved or disappeared entirely. However, the case continues to fascinate new generations of investigators and amateur sleuths, each hoping to find the clue that will finally unlock the secret of what happened on that humid August night in 1930. The enduring appeal of the case lies not just in its mystery, but in what it reveals about the nature of power, corruption, and justice in American society. Judge Crater's story is ultimately a story about the consequences of moral compromise and the price of knowing too much in a world where powerful interests are willing to kill to protect their secrets. His legacy serves as a reminder that the fight against corruption and organized crime is never truly finished, and that the institutions of justice require constant vigilance to prevent them from being corrupted by the very forces they are supposed to control. The judge who knew too much paid the ultimate price for his knowledge, but his story continues to educate and warn others about the dangers of compromise with criminal forces. The phrase "Judge Crater, call your office" may have faded from popular usage, but the lessons of his disappearance remain as relevant today as they were in 1930. In a world where corruption and criminal influence continue to threaten democratic institutions, the story of the judge who vanished serves as both a warning and an inspiration for those who are committed to the cause of justice. Now that you have heard the complete story, we want to hear your final opinion in the comments. Was Judge Crater a victim of the system he served, or did his own moral compromises make his fate inevitable? If real stories like this, which expose the complex truths hidden behind the simple pages of history, are important to you, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications, so you never miss a chapter from the past. And don't leave just yet. Please watch our next video, already recommended for you on your screen, about another mystery that history has tried to forget.